I once heard that blue jays are buttholes. Apparently, they bully other birds, raid their nests, break their eggs, and eat their babies. But the thing is, I didn't know that before I started working on this beautiful and over-the-top birdhouse specifically for them. And when I did a little research, ChatGPT assured me that it's just a natural part of life and that a good handful of other birds do this too. So for now, I'll stick to my original opinion of blue jays before I learned all of this information. The dazzling and handsome gentlemen and gentle ladies of the sky. And hopefully, future tenants to this lovely little mansion that I'm building. When I first started researching birdhouses, I ended up finding a ton of amazing styles. I found that the ones I most enjoyed were the ones that had a more minimal, modern, mid-century, or even futuristic look. But the style that ended up catching my eye the most was an Asian aesthetic. There's something about that old architecture look that I feel like you don't see very often in the US, especially for birdhouses. And I thought, why don't I make one? As I dug deeper down the rabbit hole, my research eventually narrowed down to looking at street lamps in Japan. And just for clarification, the street lamps I took inspiration from are way different than the paper lamps you see at sushi places or those big paper ones at IKEA. And after browsing through hundreds and hundreds of street lamps, my thoughts on how I wanted the design to look like finally started to take shape. And as usual with my trusty notebook, because I can't for the life of me be happy drawing on a tablet, I sketched it out. A few of y'all love asking me why I make 3D models for my projects. And well, it's because it makes the job easier and better for me. I can finalize all my proportions, dimensions, and cut lists, figure out what kinds of parts I might need, and at the end of the day, there's just less wasted effort. I started off working on the bottom of the housing first. Because this birdhouse is on a smaller scale, many of the parts I'll need to cut are gonna be less than 12 inches, and that's exactly where I messed up. That's right, literally within the first few cuts, I had messed up already. And that's also right. I just gotten done talking about how making 3D models meant a lot less wasted effort too. What I did was accidentally cut the board shorter than what I needed, and after spending some time to try and calculate whether or not I could save that cut and get it to work, I just didn't have enough material on me to do anything else. And additionally, the lumberyard already closed for the day. The only thing I could do was wait until the next day to pick up some more wood. So that's what I did, and I was finally able to move on. It wasn't really a waste of material, just a little bit of a waste in time due to the material I had on hand. And speaking of what I had on hand, some of the inspiration for this project actually came from my infamous pile of lumber and wood that I've been hoarding for years. The wood that you see me working with is ipe, and the cut that I messed up with the first day was from a piece of ipe that I had with me for I don't know, about 6 years already, so finally getting to use that piece was some next level satisfaction. Now, before I start talking about why I chose ipe, I wanted to catch you up with what's been happening on the screen. I've just finished making the top and bottom frames of the box, and afterwards, I'll be moving on to make the sides of the box as well as the corner pieces. When I was deciding on what material to use, the two species I'd contemplated between were ipe and cedar. Both of these contenders had been in my stash for about the same amount of time and are very resilient in outdoor environments. What drove me to go with ipe were its warm brown hues and slightly green undertone. I felt like these colors would be perfect against the greens of the trees in the backyard, and additionally, I really appreciated the consistency of its color. I could only imagine that its already beautiful tones would get deeper once I put on some finishing, giving it a little bit of extra visual weight. And as a final fun fact of my choice, ipe is also much denser and heavier than cedar, coming in at roughly 3500 on Jenga scale as compared to cedar's 350. Two things that I want to note at the moment are number one, what I'm doing with these corner columns, and number two, the fact that I've only been using the Festool cordless table saw. For the panels on the sides of the birdhouse, I'm using 8-inch plywood, Russian Baltic birch to be exact. And some of you might be wondering why I decided to use such a thin material. Don and I have just started a laser cutting side business called Laser Katsu, and this has been one of our main materials, making it readily available around the shop. Being that I'm doing my best to use what I have, that made it the perfect candidate for this project. Plus, Russian Baltic birch isn't a material to just roll your eyes over. It's sturdy, won't expand and contract too much, and because a birdhouse is already going to have some weight from the ipe, using a lighter material for the walls might be beneficial for easier, long-term care and maintenance. Because after all, I think you have to go in and clean birdhouses out every now and then so that the next bird family can go in and nest. And just as a side note, Laser Katsu has launched, and if you're interested at all at how that's going, check it out on any of the channels because Don's going to be creating short-form content about its business journey. To make sure the panels aren't too flimsy, I made grooves along the sides of the corner columns for the panels to slide in, and you'll also see me adding grids to the panels for both the aesthetic and some extra reinforcement. And why, oh why, am I only using Festool cordless table saw? There are 3 reasons really. Number 1, I'm working with Festool on a short video about the table saw. Number 2, I genuinely like using it for projects that have a lot of small parts and require precision. And number 3, choosing to use it as much as possible on a project like this will give me a chance to push the machine and see how much it can or can't do. I use it on a couple parts of projects in the past, but not that long with this level of intricacy. To add some gravity to the plywood, I decided to paint them with something called India ink, which, fun fact, is also called Chinese ink. If you've never heard of it before, India ink is made of carbon black, which is a fine black powder made from the incomplete combustion of heavy petroleum products like coal tar, ethylene cracking tar, or even vegetable oil. Usually they mix it with water along with a binding agent like gelatin or shellac. Not only does it feature a deep and rich black color, it's also waterproof, dries to a matte finish, and even absorbs UV light, giving it some extra protection against the sun, making it a great option for this birdhouse since it's gonna stay outside. How did I know all the other information about it though? ChatGPT, my friends. ChatGPT. I do think it's pretty common for woodworkers to use India ink to paint their pieces, but I have had a rather interesting personal experience with it. One time, I had a panel that I painted with India ink. The panel needed to be trimmed just a hair off, so I took it over to the table saw, and as soon as I started to push the panel through, the blade immediately dropped down. The table saw was indeed a saw-stop table saw, and I was completely dumbfounded as to why the cartridge was triggered. The ink was fully dry, so what could it be? Well, turns out, and huge thanks again to my friend ChatGPT, the carbon particle in India ink can be conductive. And the way that the saw-stop system works is by detecting changes in electrical signals caused by conductive materials, like ourselves, and like the carbon particles in India ink. Crazy, huh? As you can see, I have just finished making a whole bunch of sticks and made dado cuts to connect them together with half-lap joints. These grids are the aesthetic supports I was talking about for the panels, and I think my strategy of gluing the grids together first and then gluing the grids to the panels was a great decision. I was able to take care of all the glue squeeze outs right away and overall made this glue up process very smooth and enjoyable. And before I could start gluing up the panels to the corner columns, I needed to make some angle cuts on the top and bottom edges to make sure that the top and bottom frames could sit flat. Now, here's a fun story. Originally, I was planning to prepare the top and bottom sticks in a way where their faces would still be a 1/4 inch thick. To accomplish that, I would have also needed to cut those handful of sticks at a 5-degree angle, and I was pretty determined to do it. As soon as I started cutting the sticks though, I discarded the plan. I said, Clara, No, this is called torture. And I instead proceeded to cut everything square, glue them to each other, and cut the 5-degree angle off the top and bottom like you saw. The difference is literally impossible for people to see immediately, and I'm pretty darn sure the birds won't notice either. I'll even give you an up-close of the grid. Can't tell, right? So when I was doing my research on how to make birdhouses, I remember reading an article that mentioned making vents for air circulation. It wasn't until after I'd already glued the bottom panel to the frame that I remembered. But I thought, you know what? I can still laser cut some vents on this thing. Now I have no idea what an ideal air vent size would be. Like, what if I make one too big and the baby bird's dainty little feet fall through it? Eventually, I landed on the idea of making some soft, tiny triangles by the corners. Unexpectedly, I ended up using the laser cutter in an interesting way by making an angle cut with the laser. I'm sure there are advanced laser machine users that do all sorts of crazy and out-of-the-box thinking, but as a newbie, I was pretty proud of myself. I was even thinking about how if I tried to do this in school, the staff would have probably stopped me from doing it. Like the little daredevil I am, I first laser cut a stand that I designed to hold the wall panel at a 5-degree angle. Then I set the laser's focus point at the highest point, and even though it might seem as if I'm approaching this with an air of confidence, I really had zero clue as to how this was gonna work out. I didn't even do a test cut. Like, ooh, how daredevil of me. During the angled laser cut, I did notice a flame coming through the backside of the panel, which was definitely pretty iffy, but I just held my breath, kept an eye on it, and let it continue the cut until it was done. The back of the panel was quite burnt from the flame, but at the end of the day, the angle that I wanted was cut successfully. I went ahead and cut 2 more donuts out with an angle as well. These will reinforce the entry hole on the panel because the way I imagine birds around entry hole looks like this. And having that teeny bit of extra ledge space might make the experience more comfortable and supportive for them. Pretty soon now, we will be reaching the moment when a tree finally begins to bear fruit, the final stretch of the mountain where you can see the peak with your eyes, the day when a masterpiece will finally be unveiled. You get the idea. For most furniture pieces, it's the moment that the form really begins to take shape, and with this birdhouse, all the wall panels are about to be glued up to the corner columns. Remember how earlier I mentioned that I make 3D models to tweak proportions and get dimensions, right? Doing this also gives me a better understanding on how the end result is actually going to look. But the thing is, looking at a model through a screen never really gives you a good sense of scale. The only thing I had on my mind to start with is for the interior dimensions to be at least 8 cubic inches because that's what was recommended for blue jays. From there, I adjusted dimensions a little bit here and there, and since all the pieces were under 12 inches in length, I kept imagining that the birdhouse was going to be small. And when I first took a step back to take a look at it, I thought, holy crap, this is huge. Well, I was thinking that, Dawn actually said out loud, whoa, that's big. Maybe I should look into a way to put a figure in the program as a reference to size, like a human silhouette, a squirrel, or maybe a T-Rex. Yeah, definitely a T-Rex. The very last item I cut out on the laser machine was the foundation to the roof's overall framework. I'd say that figuring out the roof design was the toughest part to plan. Up until this point in the video, I didn't really have a thought out plan for the roof. The only thing I knew I wanted was for the roof to work as a cap. I wanted it to be something you can take off and put back on easily, and because of that, it also needed to have some sort of locking mechanism so that the top doesn't get blown away by a storm or anything. Part of me wanted to plan the roof to be exactly like a human house, specifically the roofs of traditional Asian architecture. But because I didn't know enough about that kind of construction, looking through some pictures and videos about it made me realize that there's a whole lot more going on than I realized. And for this birdhouse, I wasn't going for that level of complexity. I just wanted it to be simple, elegant, and functional. So instead of creating a roof with a real-to-life level of construction, I simply laser cut a sort of foundational skeleton that could support a frame that I designed to sit on top of it that would then serve as the foundation for the roof slats that I will add on top of it. In other words, I made a foundation for a foundational frame for some roof slats. I feel like I'm playing with words. Now, while I dance in circles with the shaper origin, I'm going to talk about one of the fundamentals of furniture making: grain direction, and how I totally messed this part up. Being that these mustache-looking rafters are going to be sitting diagonally, the correct way for optimum strength and what would have been better aesthetically would have been to have the grains going with their direction. But as it turned out, I only realized when I got to the last one. So what it ended up looking like is that the last one that was done properly just looks like it was the one done incorrectly. Luckily though, it's really not going to be causing any major issues because it's not like the Blue Jays are going to be stomping on the house or ripping it apart or anything. I deemed the funny mustaches okay and just continued on my way. I first started working on the centerpiece that was going to sit on top of the skeletal foundation. I gave it dado cuts to make it easier for me to find where it was going to sit, and since the splines were ready to go on the mustaches, I went ahead and started cleaning them up and giving them a good sand. One thing I started to notice here was that it was the first time I really did any sanding for this project. Usually, I'm sanding as I go, but I feel like if I try to sand any of the small pieces, I just end up doing more damage than good. Also, if I'm being honest, all the cuts I'd made on the table saw so far were so crisp and clean that I guess I never really felt that need to sand anything. As another fun fact, this is actually the very first time I've ever worked with Ipe, and my experience working with it has been quite smooth. The only time I really felt that infamous Ipe density is when it came to chiseling out some notches by hand. Even though it was a really small amount to chisel, the process was tough. When I got to the middle mustache, I'd originally planned to carve out a dado along the curve to accommodate for its contact with the skeletal structure. The front and back mustache are basically floating, so it wasn't something I needed to worry about for them. But after my experience with cleaning out the notches not too long ago, I said fuck it. Instead of doing that, I took the middle mustache over to the side and routed out a big chunk of it. It literally went from being a full Pringles mustache to a slightly skimpier one. And I'm not the least bit sad about it. If I would have gone the route of hand chiseling the dado slots, I think I would have been chiseling for weeks. Now with the front and back mustaches glued to the spine, I took some time to look at the structure so far because I feel like something was amiss. That feeling I found was that I thought the foundational structure was too wide open. I mean, yeah, I did design the frame to be very minimal. And yes, there are gonna be slats on the outer roof as well, so it wasn't like the rain was gonna magically make it past them and fly through the house. But something about it still felt too exposed. Because of that, I decided to go ahead and create some flat roof sheets to fill in that emptiness. And underneath, I added some beams to give them a little extra support. And what you see on the screen right now are most definitely toothpicks. I needed a way to reinforce all the glue joints I made, and the way I wanted to do that are with dowel joints. And how perfect is a toothpick for a tiny project like this? The first time I'd ever used a toothpick as a dowel joint wasn't today though. It was from a woodworking class I took in college, and I remember thinking that it was one of the funniest things I'd done, but equally brilliant. It feels good to be able to bring it around full circle and apply it to a project today. When I decided on it and started adding them to the birdhouse though, a part of me was slightly worried about the color contrast between the toothpick and the rest of it. But even that worked out well. That contrast actually looked slightly decorative. So, double win to the toothpick. Now, throughout this project, there were a handful of moments where I basically winged it, but this part was the ultimate wing. I'm now making the roof slats for the birdhouse, and to start things off, I first literally guessed a width that felt good enough to cover up the rafts. I tilted the blade about 2 degrees and just went ahead and started cutting the boards. The widths of the boards I cut ended up being a hair taller than the table saw blade. I could have cut them off completely on the saw stop, but I was determined only to use Festool table saw for this project. So I cut the tiny remaining sliver that's holding the pieces together with a pull saw. When I cut the pieces using the full height of the blade, I was expecting to feel a lot more resistance, but the table saw surprised me once again, and every cut was butterly smooth. After trimming the slats, I went over to start putting them onto the rafters to see how it fit and looked. And I didn't really like the amount of gap that I saw when the slats overlapped each other. So I went back and made rabbet cuts on them so that each of the slats could have a lap joint. Earlier, I know I mentioned that I wasn't going to sand any of the smaller pieces or parts because I was worried that it would do more damage than good. But one thing I am going to do is round over all the corners because the crispy cuts that I got from the table saw made all these edges sharp as a razor blade. Like, have you ever gotten cut by a sharp corner on lumber? It feels very disrespectful. Kind of like getting a paper cut, which I can at least understand because paper is so thin. But come on, a corner of a piece of wood? I'd rather get a splinter. Actually, I take that back. I went ahead and painted the foundational roof too, and while painting it, I was reminded me of a recent conversation I had with Don. Did you know that black peppercorn is a fruit? I had no idea. For my entire life, I never even considered the idea that peppercorn was a fruit. I thought it was a seed or something. I think the fact that they put corn at the end of pepper makes it super confusing. I spent quite a bit of time Googling images of pepper, and even then, it was hard to accept. But anyways, if you guys have any fun facts that shook you to the core, let me know in the comments. Now, the way that I'm gonna glue all of the housing parts together is by yet again dowel joints. But this time, toothpicks aren't gonna cut it because I'm gluing up the big stuff now. Since I wanted to use EPIT for the dowels too, I went ahead and ordered a dowel maker, and making them was easy breezy. I simply used the leftover 1/4-inch sticks I had, tightened them to a drill, and voila. Dowels were made, and all the major pieces of the body were now securely assembled. Now that I got the body of the birdhouse ready to go, it's time to start finishing up this roof. I cut them all to the final length that I needed them to be and made a little spacer to figure out where I wanted my starting point. From there, I went ahead and started gluing the slats on one by one, and since they were all resting on a slope, I secured each row of slats with the trusty toothpick technique. Did I expect to use toothpicks for this project? Not at all. Am I happy I did? 1000% yes. With the roof slats done, the next step was the simplest glue up in the entire project. Gluing the exterior roof to the foundational roof. I drilled a couple holes to glue in some more toothpicks, and when I glued the foundational roof to the exterior, if you have an extremely good eye, you might have noticed that I actually applied glue to a surface that had absolutely zero contact with anything whatsoever. I basically spaced out for a moment and realized it as soon as I flipped the piece over. I told myself, Clara, you dum-dum. And I proceeded first with finishing the glue up and then wiped off all the completely useless glue. And now, I have finally reached the last part of this dragon painting. What am I talking about, you ask? Well, there's actually an old Chinese folktale about an extraordinary painter who painted dragons on temple walls, but whenever he painted one, he always intentionally left out the eyes. Whenever people asked him why, he said that the moment he added the eyes, the dragons would come to life. Of course, the people didn't believe him, so when he went ahead and added the eyes to one of them, it sprang to life and flew right off the wall. It's a funny story I read from a comic book as a kid, and in this case, this tall and mighty centerpiece for the roof is, to me, the eyes of my dragon painting. The goal I had in mind for this centerpiece was to give it that final touch to balance out the rest of the birdhouse. There was enough rigidity in the lines throughout the birdhouse. The mustache rafters were originally designed in that way to create a softness, but it kind of got buried under all the roof slats. So that made the centerpiece my last hope to effectively harmonize the piece. I glued up some pieces together to get a thicker bottom so that I'd have enough space to carve out curves in 3 directions: the front, the top, and the ends. I cut out a rough shape using the bandsaw and then used a die grinder along with an angle grinder to carve the rest away. After attaching it to the birdhouse with some dowel joints, the dragon's eyes were officially complete. Now, of course, just because the eyes were done doesn't mean that the whole project was complete. The last few things I did from this point included drilling holes for these simple locking pins to go in, a healthy second to admire this amazingly bougie birdhouse before I put finishing on it, spraying it with some Helmsman spar urethane to give it some extra protection against the outdoor elements, and last but not least, setting it up outside. Voila. Hello, welcome back to a post-show hangout session. I feel like it's been a while since I posted a video, well, especially since I paused making short videos. I'd say it has helped me a lot on focusing building, which I like the most. I'm happy that I'm done building this birdhouse that's been a plan for such a long time. One thing that still shocks me till this very moment is just how ginormous it came out. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I wanted to share a special thank you to my new Patreons, Jan and Alistair. Your support means a lot to me, and I cannot thank you enough. All of you, not just my Patrons, but everyone who's watching this video. You guys are the reason I can continue to share what I love doing. One last update before I sign out. From here on, I'll be posting one video on the first Friday of each month. I know it's getting a lot slower at Clara's Woodshop in the beginning, but this is a healthy balance I found that I can do for a long time. But you can find Dawn and myself adventuring around at Dawn's Journal. So if you miss us, go check it out over there. That's all for today. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.